I'm going to talk today about Augustine's idea of confession, and with some attention to the question of how he tells the story. And I'd like to start by saying that Augustine tells the story of his conversion many times across his career, starting almost immediately with a series of philosophical dialogues within months of his conversion, and in which he, as it were, gives one interpretation of what the conversion means, and then he successively returns later in his career to talk about what happened, and the meaning changes. One of the most interesting things about the Confessions is we don't know its date. And as a result, we don't know where he is in the process of transforming his memory of his conversion. And in that sense, how we analyze the Confessions actually could potentially help us to understand where it fits in the puzzle, possibly, but not necessarily giving us a date. The traditional date for the Confessions is around the year 400, which is roughly 3 years after Augustine is consecrated as bishop. So the idea is he is early in his experience as a member of the clerical establishment with responsibility for the care of souls. And that's something that I think is very interesting. And where I am currently on the question of date, which may change by the end of today, is that I think this actually fits very nicely as a date, because in some ways you can see that Augustine's account of his own conversion doesn't reflect his mature thought. And one important way in which it doesn't reflect his mature thought is that he seems to be very hopeful that this event has given him a kind of closure. And in his later career, once the cares of being a bishop really start to bite for Augustine in the years, roughly speaking, from 410 until his death in the 420s, he's dealing with intractable situations in a context of civil war that really change his sense of what is possible here on earth. So in that sense, it seems natural to read the comparatively hopeful story of the Confessions as one that comes from very early in his career as a bishop, where he's still very hopeful about being buoyed by God's grace into being able to do unambiguous good in the world. And by the end of his career, his view will be very much, particularly as he expresses it in The City of God, that here in the seculum, unambiguous good is not possible because we're bound by time, and therefore we can never know the consequences of our own actions. So in that sense, there's a question here, something that's fantastically interesting in terms of what I just said, is the Confessions falls naturally into two uneven parts. The first part is an autobiographical narrative that starts with Augustine's own babyhood and goes through to the death of his mother some 33 years later. So the first part of his life, with a focus on his family life and his friendships and his human relationships as a frame for his relationship to God. And then the second half of the Confessions is a meditation on time and memory. We're not absolutely certain that these two parts were written at the same time. And in that sense, there's an intriguing possibility that the second half, it's not precisely a half, but the second part of the Confessions could be a return to ask himself why what's in the first part is so different to him as a reader at a later stage of his life. That's not at all a hypothesis that I can prove. It's just a thought. But it's interesting, I think, for the question that Alexis has posed about to what extent is metanoia a process that human beings experience, and to what extent is it a process that human beings can ever complete during the course of their life, as opposed to being a process that, in a sense, can only be completed arbitrarily by the accident of death. And it would be very Augustinian, I think, to follow this second interpretation. So that's something we can come back to in the discussion. I'll turn now to my prepared text, which starts with an introduction to a few theories that have been influential in the English-speaking world for thinking about conversion. And for English speakers, the sort of the great idol is William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, which was written 100 years ago, a little bit over 100 years ago, and which is one of the early texts that that attempts a psychological approach to an understanding of religious experience, really just at the moment where, where Freud is not yet the icon that he will become. So it's very much a kind of homemade American professor's idea of what psychology might become. But one of the things that he comes upon, and he's influenced by Augustine's narrative, is the idea of the turning point, of the peak experience, of the moment where an individual reaches the watershed from which he can see the future, and after which everything will happen in terms framed by the moment of change. And later psychological analyses of this have been have questioned this idea of the peak experience as being in any way decisive. And one of the models that I find most fascinating is the model put forward by Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, who argues that a conversion can never be complete, and he comes up with the famous idea of one step at a time. And something that is fascinating is that, in fact, this idea can be traced back through mid-20th century philosophical writings, particularly of Reinhold Niebuhr's Nature and Destiny of Man. This idea actually can be traced back to Augustine. So interestingly, Augustine has his own kind of comeback. The two Augustines are already in play in the mid-20th century English-speaking world, which is something that I love. You just can't put this man down. So what I'm going to start with is looking at some of the paradigms of conversion that are currently in play in the English-speaking world, in the study of late antiquity, that inform how contemporary late Romanists read the Confessions, and then I'm going to turn to walk through some of the key passages of the text to open up some questions that I hope we can then discuss. So to start with, I've given you some passages from two highly eminent Roman historians who have been fascinated by the question of religious conversion. And I start with an article which Ramsay MacMullen wrote some 40 years ago on two types of conversion to early Christianity. And what MacMullen does is he takes a question that has long troubled English speakers, really right back to the Enlightenment and to David Hume's writings on the miraculous, and he asks to what extent can we talk about a kind of conversion that is an impulsive response to the experience of the miraculous, as opposed to a conversion that is more cognitive and intellectual? And what McMullen argues, in the first quotation on the handout, you'll see a passage where he talks about what pagans saw in Christianity, and he begins almost instinctively, but I think it's really a sense of where he thinks his reader is going to start. He begins with an intellectualist vision of what conversion might be, and it's a moment of an intellectual paradigm shift. And he looks at what a pagan literate person might be aware of when they have first contact with Christianity, and how it is that the ideas of Christianity could offer a paradigm that would be persuasive to them. Now, Augustine's account of this in some ways undermines McMullen's model of how a pagan would respond to Christianity, because Augustine, in his own writings, talks about as a rising intellectual, he has a chair of rhetoric in the city of Milan, so he's, in a sense, the equivalent of a modern university professor. And he talks about how he found the Gospels repulsive because of the language register in which they were written, and because of the sort of folksy philosophy of Jesus's sayings. He simply felt that it wasn't possible for a person like him to gain access to teaching through this medium. And it's only later that he discovers that there's a way of reading these texts, a kind of hermeneutical key that will make them meaningful. So at one level, I want to register some frustration with McMullen on this idea of intellectual conversion. But what he reads are a number of philosophical dialogues that have been written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries where two philosophers debate the merits of different paradigms of how the universe is organized and what kind of motivating force is at its center. And to be fair, this philosophical work really does become very important in the 4th century, at the moment where philosophically trained men and some women are converting to Christianity. There is a fantastic mapping effort of trying to understand how Neoplatonic ideas of the one can be mapped into the sacred narrative of the creator God. And people like Gregory of Nazianzen and eventually Augustine himself will play a really critical role in this philosophical work. So going over to the second paradigm, McMullen sees in the sources that when Christian historians talk about conversion, they almost always talk about a situation where a miracle worker performs miracles in front of a crowd, or a preacher preaches about miracles in front of a crowd. And these moments of crowd conversion, McMullen thinks, are really central because they carry an idea of supernatural force displayed, and just because of the experience of encountering this force, individuals feel moved to follow the speaker towards this force. Now, this second idea of conversion, I think, is actually quite, to me, very interesting, because McMullen, who was not at all inclined to think abstract philosophical thoughts about religion, but he's intuitively reaching for an understanding of conversion as being relational and as being about trust. And this is something that comes very closely towards an idea that I think is really central for understanding. I'm going to skip a little bit of historiography that I've given you on the handout and go straight, looking at the clock, to the model of religious allegiance that I think really does a good job of accounting for the phenomenon that McMullen points to. And that's the idea that fides, or faith, in the early Christian context really can be understood in two ways. One is a fides of proposition that in English would be translated as belief, and it's an idea of an intellectual paradigm of how the world works, which gets encapsulated into doctrine. The second idea of fides, which I think has not received nearly enough attention in studies of early Christian religious conversion, is the idea of fides as being relational. The English translation would be fidelity, which also, of course, comes from the word fides, rather than the idea of belief. So it's a non-cognitive understanding where the experience of fidelity is about trust, it's about accepting authority, looking for accountability, and experiencing belonging. And this idea of fides as entering a community of trust, and particularly entering a relationship of trust with a trusted leader or a trusted teacher, is, I think, enormously important. And it's really worth going back and reading many texts, not just Augustine, in light of this different understanding of transformation. And I hope that's something that we can come back to in our wider discussions. Again, I'm going to summarize very briefly the work of Rodney Stark, who's a 20th century sociologist of religion who looks at religious conversion to new religious movements. And his question was about what is it that makes people decide to become accountable to a new community. And one of the debates that he's involved in is a question about whether there was a theory that, and there remains a theory that the thing that makes people move into a new movement is a rejection of the values of an old paradigm, and they're trying, in a sense, to make a gesture, a negative gesture towards their previous community of affiliation. And what Stark wanted to argue, and does eventually find a way to argue, is that the people who are most likely to convert are people who have already weakened their ties to their previous paradigm. You're much less likely to convert from one religion to another if you perceive yourself to be a needed key player in your community. But for those people who have drifted to the margins of their community of affiliation, the process by which they join a community is not one of rejecting the old values, but it's one of attraction to the norms of a new community. And so what he tried to understand in his fieldwork was, first of all, is this the case? And second of all, why are people attracted? It's well known, and it was well known in the mid-20th century when Stark and his colleague Laughlin started doing this fieldwork. It was known that retrospective accounts of religious conversion tend to focus on the difficulty and the intellectual wrestling of a paradigm shift, that I'm having trouble letting go of my model of reality and moving over to a new understanding. And some interesting fieldwork has been done on that phenomenon. What Stark became fascinated by was the question of whether you could capture people before they converted and find out what they thought at the moment of joining a new group. And so what he did was and he had some good luck in this, was he decided to start following missionaries and interviewing the people who were encountering them. And he had the good fortune to become aware of the fact that the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who was doing really well with getting followers in Korea, that he was sending missionaries to the U.S. And so Stark, by a process that I find fascinating and don't understand, managed to get in touch and get permission to follow these people in their first encounters with the U.S., where they did, in record time, build a really extraordinary movement, beginning with those first two missionaries in California. And what Stark found, just to be very brief, was that if you interviewed people as they were encountering, he's following the missionary and doing interviews, what he discovers is that the people who come back a second and third time are not the people who like the ideas. They're the people who like the social tone of the group. They like the individuals. They like the way they're talking about community. And he has a he has a quote in the second quote on page 3. He says, when we talked to people a year later, they would explain their conversion as being because they liked the ideas of the group. But when we went back to our notes, we discovered that they were talking about the religious beliefs of their new set of friends that was really quite odd. But they liked the people, so they decided to come back. So in that sense, this idea, it's a sort of, I don't know if the sociologists in the room will really accept this, but to me, as a non-sociologist, I love the idea of finding an empirical way to test this idea of affinity and relational dimensions being so central in the process that attracts someone. What Stark then does with this, which I may not be as critical for our project, is that he then gets very interested in how people, once they've chosen a new relationship of affiliation, in how the community builds a sense of commitment and turns the new participant from a consumer into a producer. And this idea of getting people to move as quickly as possible into a mode of sharing the word to a wider community is something that I think is extraordinarily interesting, but I'm not sure how closely it parallels our needs in this project. So I want to turn now to Augustine and what I call his Russian doll of interconnected stories. Something that once you look for it becomes really obvious in the Confessions, is a pattern where again and again in Book 8, which is the book of the Confessions, where he talks about his own moment of conversion. There's an attempt at the top of page 4 to kind of visualize this, and he makes it clear that the mechanics of his own transition from being a seeker who, in books 1 to 7, he's tried lots of different philosophical approaches, and he spent a period with the Manichees, which he found initially very exciting and then really disappointing when he finally discovered that his teacher really couldn't answer his questions. And of course, the poor man didn't know that he was dealing with this, what would become a great philosophical mind. So that was really, bad luck for him. But Augustine talks about how he starts to find individuals who are able to tell him stories about others who have been in his position. And something that I haven't quite figured out yet with this storytelling is there seems to be there are three places in the triangle. There's Augustine the listener, there's the exemplum, the individual who's being proposed to him as someone against whom to measure himself. But there's also the relationship with the storyteller, which I think is uniquely important in this account. You know, that individual who's kind of mediating and acting as in some sense, as a gatekeeper to invite him in, but not only as a gatekeeper in a negative way, but also as a host. And I think these host individuals play a crucial role, but I think it's much harder to be a host without a story. It's much easier to be a host pointing to a third element rather than simply saying, come to me, and I alone will fix it. I think if you want to be a populist demagogue, you can do it for yourself. But if you want to be affecting religious conversion, I think you need. It's much more powerful to be pointing towards something that you see as uniquely valuable and in offering to share it. So I've given English translation of Pusey. It's a 19th century Oxford Movement translation, but the language is so marvelous that I did look for an electronic version of the Source Chrétienne so that I could kind of give you a French version, but I wasn't able to find, to gain access. We're in Book 8, and I'm starting right at the beginning. The first quote, he talks about how he had been reading the Gospels, but he couldn't make the connection. And the Gospels repeatedly have this saying, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. But he doesn't have ears to hear yet, and he's aware, well, looking back at it anyway, he thinks of himself as someone who did not have ears to hear. So he starts with a conversation with an older Christian who will become afterwards Bishop of Milan, and Simplicianus. And he tells Simplicianus about his struggles with the book, and Simplicianus starts to tell him a story of Marius Victorinus, who is one of the great philosophers of the 4th century, who had himself been going through a conversion. And what Simplicianus emphasizes in this story is how Victorinus had actually solved all of the philosophical questions, and he even told Simplicianus that he saw himself as a Christian. But Simplicianus says, no, you're not a real Christian if you don't go to church. Victorinus then has the famous saying, do walls then make a Christian? Is that what would make me a Christian? And Simplicianus says yes. And he understands that for Victorinus, it's sort of, joining the riffraff in the church is going to be upsetting to his status as an educated man. But he argues that it's an essential step. Partly it's a move of humility for Victorinus, but also Victorinus himself starts to understand that being part of the community of accountability really is central to the change of ethos, and ultimately, I think Simplicianus would say this, maybe not so much Victorinus. Victorinus seems to have seen it as a question right at the bottom of the page. He became bold-faced against vanity. He realized that it was his vanity that was holding him back. But Simplicianus also has the idea that it is contribution to this community of practice that is going to be what makes a real spiritual progress become possible. And Augustine's takeaway in 8.5.10, right, second quote on page 5, is that he was on fire to imitate Victorinus. This story had captured his imagination, and the parasocial relationship of imitation is what gives him now motivation. Shortly afterwards, in the narrative, I'm not sure about the actual historical time, he's with his friend Alypius, and they meet Ponticianus, another another man who tells a story of a conversion that he had witnessed. And what's interesting about Ponticianus' story is that this is a kind of hall of mirrors where Ponticianus tells a story about his friend, but the friend had read the Athanasius' Life of Antony and had read a story in which Antony was walked into a church and heard the gospel read, and the gospel that he read was the story of Jesus preaching to the rich young man who said to him, "How can I be perfect?" And Jesus says to him, this is Matthew 19:21, Jesus says, "If you would be perfect, go sell all you have, give to the poor, and come follow me." And so that sort of hall of mirrors by which he gets to the word of Jesus becomes the way where Augustine can hear the word of the gospel for the first time. And it's, it's sort of mediated by all of these relationships of trust, of friends telling stories about the experience of other friends. And so there's a whole kind of network of people. When he then comes back to his own reaction, his first effort is to tell his friend Alypius, and then they go to tell his mother, Monica. And Monica reveals that this is what she has been praying for all along. So he kind of wraps this back into his vision of the action of God in the world being articulated through the human relationships that play out in human community. And I think that's a good place to end, because it's the moment where Augustine shows, again, it's a kind of hopeful vision. He hasn't yet gotten to all of the failures and disappointments, but nonetheless, it's a vision which integrates the spiritual plane with the plane of human relationships in everyday reality. And I think it's important because it allows us to see this human level as not necessarily being a kind of reductionist sense of, oh, well, people are just looking for a club to belong to. Augustine sees this as actually how God works in the world. So I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you.